Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be here. I was pitched as the secret speaker. You probably expected Bill Clinton or Sheryl Sandberg, so this is a real letdown. I also realize I'm the only thing that's standing between you and the drinks afterwards, so it's a pretty tough situation to be in, but bear with me for 15 minutes at least, okay? The reason I am here today is because I want to talk about something very important. So I think that some of the activities that people who influence public opinion, so maybe PR professionals, communication professionals, politicians, people who advise politicians and people who advise companies, some of the activities that they engage in are actually, I feel, pretty detrimental to democracies, pretty detrimental to ability of people to make good decisions and engage in constructive debates. I didn't have too much time to prepare a very fancy presentation, but there are three things that I can offer for you. Firstly, I will very briefly tell you who am I, where do I come from, what are the two weird lives that I've been leading. I promise not to be too long and not be too annoying while I do that. Secondly, I will tell you about why I feel that the communication profession is engaged in some activities that are not great for democracies. And thirdly, so it wouldn't be completely depressing, I will also give a few suggestions of how I feel that this profession can actually improve and become better. Okay? So firstly, this is a weird presentation. It always happens, that's fine. I feel I have been I'm basically leading two lives. In my day life, I work at a company called Infogram, which is something that Dagny already mentioned. So for those of you who don't know, Infogram has created a tool that can be used by non-professionals, journalists, social media marketers, educators, to create convincing data visualizations and embed them in different stories, in articles, in social media content, in other types of things. I feel you should take a look at that, and we've been doing reasonably well. We have more than 1 million users worldwide, more than 20 million people see our content regularly, and we have more than 30 people here based in Riga, in San Francisco, and also representatives in Brazil and Japan. And there I'm the head of finance, so the boring guy who deals with numbers, sometimes with strategy as well. But then there's my other life. When I was still at university, I was a very keen debater, which basically means that there's a sort of movement in some countries stronger than others, but in the United Kingdom there's a very strong movement where students engage in debate tournaments, which means that they debate and discuss about a wide range of topics, but they debate in a very particular way. They debate in a way that rewards rational arguments, arguments that are based on data, arguments that are not based on logical fallacies, arguments that, are less based on emotions and more based on sort of more rational side of the brain. And when I returned back home here in Latvia, I felt that we needed something similar here. So together with a few of my friends, we set up an NGO called Domā in 2013 that does two things primarily. Firstly, we try to make sure that a lot of young people have access to this kind of debating, argumentation, and critical thinking education. That means we run workshops, we translate educational materials from English to Latvian, we run educational workshops for high school teachers. And secondly, we organize public debates. We do that in public forums, in some universities, also on the radio of public broadcaster 5LV, in the show Domā, and also on the website of a magazine It. You can see there's a section called It Debates. Anyways, those are my two lives. When I mention to people I have two lives, in my own head, that I imagine like it's very cool. It's like being a Batman where in my day life I do something, and in my night life I do something. But when I tell to people, they're like, no, not really. As Batman, during the day you're a billionaire philanthropist, and during the night you fight crime, and I'm just a geek in my day life, and I'm just a debating geek in my night life. So really not that cool as it sounds. But moving further, what is exactly that I want to talk about today? Let me do a sort of short, boring philosophical note about what I think democracies and free markets are. In some sense, democracies are a sort of a decision-making tool for people, or a search for better answers. If you're a citizen and you're trying to decide who to vote for, you want to look at different alternatives, you want to make the best decision possible. If you're a citizen thinking about which policy to support, you want to look at different alternatives, make the best decision. As a consumer, when you're at a shop, you want to buy something, it's still the same principles apply. You want to look at different options, make the best decision. Well, there are certain ways how to make these decisions, but one thing is clear. Sometimes in democracies and in free markets, there are right and wrong answers, okay? It's not all subjective. There are right and wrong answers. Imagine if you're a voter and you deeply care about, say, immigration reform, okay? Your right decision is not to vote for the politician that just looks good, talks good, creates a nice-looking poster. Your right decision is to vote for the politician that has the best policy, has the best people who can actually implement this policy. So there is a right answer. Or imagine as a consumer, right? Imagine your goal is to be fit, right? And have a good health. Maybe you should actually decide to buy the right drink that can help you deal with these things, not the drink that has loads of sugar and just has nice green packaging and says like, be really fit at the bottom, right? You need to have these things. And I feel there's a role for debates. Debate is nothing else than a sort of rational discussion where you confront two sides so that people can make the best possible decisions. And in our organization, in Domā, we think that to kind of actually drive these debates, two things need to hold. Firstly, you want to make sure that as many people as possible have access to the sort of skills that you need to engage in these debates. That means ability to argue really well, based on data, based on arguments that are not linked with logical fallacies and other things. And secondly, that they have access to critical thinking, so the ability to evaluate what other people are telling to you. The second thing that we think is really important besides those things is that citizens need to have access to regular high-quality debates on different topics so that they actually can look at these arguments. They can, this is the argument for voting for this politician, this is the argument against voting for this politician, I will probably vote for him, right? So you need that. So here's the thing. I feel, and I will describe in more detail why, that people who are engaged in creating public opinion, all the people I mentioned, are often enough engaging in activities that undermine these processes that are super important for democracies and for making best decisions. There are two levels of that. The first level is less evil. I will describe it this way. So the first level that happens is that people who advise public personas or companies, they advise them to have a very rigid, crafted message that doesn't have any real substance about the real benefits or disadvantages of making a certain decision. Many of you are from Latvia. You all have watched shows like sastrēgums on the right. And someone asks a question to a politician, and instead of hearing the answer to this question, you just hear a sort of a selection of certain keywords that appeal to the target demographic, right? So if you're from the party that is more like anti-EU, anti-international, you're just going to hear terms like people who work on the lands, forests, the native land, blah, 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 blah. Things like that will happen. And these things can become a lot worse. Let me show you a short video. So some of you may know that yesterday there was a general election in the United Kingdom. And one of the parties there that actually performed pretty poorly was the Labour Party. I want to show you an interview that happened with the head of this party, Ed Miliband, in 2011, when he was asked about a particular situation. I really hope the video will work. It always doesn't, but let's try.
These strikes are wrong at a time when negotiations are still going on, but parents and the public have been let down by both sides because the government has acted in a reckless and provocative manner. After today's disruption, I urge both sides to put aside the rhetoric, get round the negotiating table and stop it happening again.
I listened to your speech in Wrexham and you talked about the Labour Party being a movement. A lot of people in that movement are the people who are on strike today, and they'll be looking at you and thinking, well, you're describing these strikes as wrong. Why aren't you giving us more leadership as a leader of the Labour movement?
At a time when negotiations are still going on, I do believe these strikes are wrong. And that's why I say both sides should, after today's disruption, get round the negotiating table, put aside the rhetoric, and sort the problem out. Because the public and parents have been let down by both sides. The government's acted in a reckless and provocative manner.
Well, I spoke to Francis Moore before I came here, and the tone he was striking was a very conciliatory one. Do you think there's a difference between the words they're saying in public and the attitude they're striking in private in these negotiations? Are there negotiations in good faith, would you say?
What I say is that the strikes are wrong when negotiations are still going on, but the government has acted in a reckless and provocative manner in the way it's gone about these issues. After today's disruption, I urge both sides to get around the negotiating table, put aside the rhetoric, and stop this kind of thing happening again.
It's a statement you've made publicly, and this will be broadcast, obviously. But have you spoken privately to any union leaders and expressed your view to them on a personal level, would you say?
Well, what I say in public and in private to everybody involved in this is get around the negotiating table, put aside the rhetoric, and stop this kind of action happening again. These strikes are wrong because negotiations are still going on, but parents and the public have been let down by the government as well, who've acted in a reckless and provocative manner.
You're a parent, I'm a parent, a lot of people watching this will be parents. Has it affected you personally, this action? Has it affected your family, your friends? And what is the net effect of that going to be on parents having to take a day off work today?
I think parents up and down the country have been affected by this action. And it's wrong at a time when negotiations are still going on. Parents have been let down by both sides because the government has acted in a reckless and provocative manner. I think that both sides should, after today's disruption, get round the negotiating table, put aside the rhetoric, and stop this kind of thing happening again.
Thank you. Okay, so what you just heard was an interviewer asking 4 or 5, I didn't count, different questions. And questions had real substance, right? The questions were asked like, what do you think about this? What do you think about what happens in context of this? And here's a politician who's a robot. He has been trained, he understands he needs to get a soundbite in the media that will emphasize certain words. Both sides get around the negotiating table. Government has acted in a reckless and provocative manner, blah, 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 blah. And I feel that instead of having a real democracy, creates, to use an unnecessarily fancy term, a sort of a simulacrum of democracy, where instead of having real democracy, where you debate, you talk about issues, you ask politicians, and what do you think we should do? Should we do this? Should we do this? Instead, you get these perfectly crafted PR messages. And I think there's something wrong with that, because people who actually are interested in issues, they can't hear the answers from the people, and they can't really familiarize themselves with issues. So I think that is a real problem. The second, I feel, more evil way of these things going wrong is I've seen recently that a new trend has emerged where often the communications profession advises their client to avoid rational debate altogether. So what you just saw was an interview in BBC with a politician who gave his answers. So maybe the answers weren't great, but he was there. But one thing that has been emerging is that often in trying to preserve your reputation or trying to preserve the opinion of the people, there has been systematic attempt to avoid debates altogether. To use the Latvian example, we all know that there are certain politicians who only go to interviews with certain types of journalists and avoid other types of journalists, including in the public broadcaster, because they think it's going to damage their reputation. Not only politicians, even you know that high-level officials who in theory are working for public money are not going there. So that's a problem because there's no real accountability towards your voters. I think that's a real problem. It doesn't only happen in Latvia, right? Recently there was a case with David Cameron from the Conservative Party that actually just won the election in the United Kingdom. He did the same thing. He simply did not attend a public debate on things. I think it's a real issue. And I want to mention a personal example about this. So you know how I run an NGO called Domā, which tries to organize public debates on all kinds of things. Here's an example that's just happening right now. We think that one of the issues that should be debated in the public is the regulation of payday lenders. So quick lenders that you're aware of, where you can borrow money with smartphone in other kinds of ways. So next Thursday, we were trying to organize a sort of a rational public debate between people who are for more strict regulation of these loans and people who are against. And we don't want it to be like a stupid debate. We try to brief people, explain them what a good argument is, how you should kind of treat, so that, if any one of you would be interested, right, you could just go to that debate and listen to the arguments and make up your own mind. And it's a balanced debate because there are good arguments on both sides, right? There are good arguments for restricting payday loans, and there are good arguments against. But what happened is when we were organizing this, and we were approaching the payday lenders, their own internal advisors advised all of them to just systematically not attend the debate, right? Because they thought that would hurt them, okay? So they all collectively, we called every single firm, they all said that they're not going, and they said, this is just not great for us. And I think that's a real shame. I think it means that sometimes this kind of advice undermines democracy. It undermines the ability of people to make good decisions. That was a bit depressing, right? What I think should change, okay? So I don't expect that all of these practices can change overnight. And there are good reasons why we wouldn't expect that they would change, right? There's competition inside in the industry. There's competition between politicians. If you don't do these things, you might lose your market share, your clients. It's all real stuff. But I think that there are certain good case studies out there that show that this kind of stuff can be done reasonably well. I think one answer that can be given is some degree of self-regulation, collective self-regulation. Take the example of journalists and the journalistic industry. One problem that journalism has right now is the emergence of native advertising. It's a situation when you read through the media and you think, it's just another article written by my journalists, but instead it's an advertisement which is paid for by the third party. So a lot of journalistic associations in different countries have come up with their own internal rules of how these kind of advertising should be labeled. And so consumers and voters can see, this is not actually, an article by journalists. It's actually an ad paid for by Nike or Coca-Cola or whoever, right? So I feel that the communications profession should do something very similar. They should have some sort of organization-wide standards that they enforce. They should talk about this. It doesn't mean that they should just completely avoid using some sort of more, emotional elements. Of course, they still should use those, but they should have a debate internally about where this right level lies. I really don't like my next slide because I put it in yesterday, but now I looked at it this morning. It really looked a bit preachy, so you have to. No, I don't. It's just a bit too bold, right? More responsibility. But I think maybe in not those terms, but I think there is a sort of responsibility for the profession and for people who influence public opinion to change the way they operate. And there are great examples out there. Look at the way journalists do these things. Look at the way some of the, for example, extractive industries like oil and gas do these things. They have some sort of professional standards to minimize the sort of problems they do for the environment. Another thing that the profession could be doing is that even if they engage in these kind of practices, they could try to do their best to promote democracy and good decisions, which could be done by, for example, funding media literacy training, critical thinking training. Okay, don't want to mention my own, but debate training to kind of teach people how to evaluate messages and evaluate arguments. I feel that is very important. I feel it can be done. There always will be someone who does these kind of things, but I feel it's a corporate social responsibility thing. This is something that needs to be done. So to give a 30-second summary, I feel in democracies, to make the best decisions, we need to have at least available debates. Not necessarily seen by all, but available debates on most important topics, debates that are rational, based on arguments, based on data. Okay? In addition to all the sexy things that we talk about. They need to happen. And if they don't happen because of certain decisions by certain agents, it's a problem. I feel that we as citizens have a certain responsibility to promote these debates. And it is, I think, very, very important. And we should do something about it. That was a bit depressing, but thank you very much. And I hope you enjoy the drinks and we can have a chat afterwards. Thank you very much.